And welcome to Against the Law, the myth-busting ancient history podcast. Joining us for our last episode of the season are our panel of history buffs. We've got Zenia, who loves to talk about all things ancient Rome, especially the Emperor Hadrian. We're also joined by Meg, who will kindly be sharing her knowledge of the ancient Greeks. There's Barney, who will take us on an educational journey to the ancient Near East. And I'm Flo. I'm here to learn with you, since I'm not an expert on any ancient civilizations, but maybe I can offer some input on today's episode. We're talking today about neurodiversity in the ancient world. Neurodiversity is a term used to describe brain differences some people might have. For example, autism, ADHD, OCD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and dyscalculia all come under the bracket of neurodiversity. We're actually recording this episode at the end of World Autism Awareness Week, which is a good time for me to share some of my knowledge since I've been diagnosed with autism myself. Of course, every neurodiverse person is different, so I can only speak for myself and my own experiences. I'm looking forward to hearing all about possibly neurodiverse people throughout history. It would be really difficult and probably inappropriate to diagnose ancient historical figures with neurodiversity. We aren't psychologists, and they're not around to talk to, so if we talk about people and their behaviours, we aren't giving them a diagnosis, we're just chatting about behaviours and how they might indicate neurodiversity. So World Autism Awareness Week for me is really interesting because being autistic, you start to see a lot of information, certainly as the years go by, better information about autism, more accurate anyway, because when I was diagnosed, it was mostly aimed at parents or carers of young children who had quite severe autism. And it's really nice to see those misconceptions start getting cleared up.
I think one of those misconceptions we might actually have to trace back to the ancient Greek language, I think, because the word autism itself comes from the ancient Greek word autos, which means self, like himself or her. Well, autos is himself. So I think that's quite a common misconception about autistic people, isn't it, Flo, that they're very sort of self-centered or self-absorbed and not able to empathize?
Definitely. I mean, even when I was diagnosed, I was, told that I would have issues with empathy. And I think actually I'm quite an empathetic person, and I always have been. I think it's true that a lot of autistic people are sort of recognised to be in their own world, but it's nothing to do with being self-centered. It's more to do with social misunderstanding, I think. And we certainly can be very empathetic people. That's really interesting. I love the meaning of words. I love it when you bring up a word meaning.
I have got so many word meanings for us today.
Oh, good. It's going to be a good one.
Would you like to hear the origin of the word panic, which I thought might be relevant given we're talking about kind of minds and brains and possibly mental health stuff?
Absolutely.
So I think this is actually quite a funny etymology for quite a serious topic. The word panic comes from the Greek god Pan. So that's where we get the Pan from. And Pan was the god of shepherds, and, he liked wandering around the forest and very much a person of nature. But he really liked taking long naps in the forest, like having a little afternoon sleep. And sometimes if he had this afternoon sleep and someone woke him up, he would shout so loudly and angrily that all the sheep around would suddenly bleat and run away. And that's where we get the word panic. So if you're panicking, etymologically speaking, you're actually just experiencing having woken someone up from a nap when they didn't want to wake up.
I love that. That's brilliant. That's like me when I'm woken up from a nap.
Exactly.
I'm going to have to get some sheep to frighten.
I love the idea that he was reacted so badly to being woken up from a nap that we now have a whole, the word for fear is named after that reaction.
So, Zenia, I know that you have done a little bit of research on ancient figures who might possibly be neurodiverse.
So just before I launch into one example that I've come across, I just want to say that there's been some medical research, some DNA research that's shown that autistic genes were definitely present at least 10,000 years ago. So we know that there have been neurodiverse people throughout history.
I wonder, Zenia, if we found the same bit of research, because as I was pulling at the threads and going back through time, I found a paper called The Stone Age Origins of Autism.
Was that Penny Spikins?
I think? Penny Spikins. Yeah. And I found that a really interesting approach because, again, that history is so ancient and so prehistoric that all you've got are these very limited traces of art in cave paintings and engravings on bones and stuff like that. And I thought it was a very novel approach to the topic, saying that, the visual memory that was seen in very limited contact with animals was enough for people to commit very detailed drawings on the walls of caves and things like that. And just wondering whether you can see any traces of autistic behaviour with that remarkable visual memory.
Yeah, there's another explanation, which I think Simon Baron-Cohen, he proposes that it's technological advancements might be a sign of an autistic or neurodiverse mind, just looking at a problem in a different way, of sort of going like, oh, here is a stick, here is a pinging string or intestine or something. What if we put these together and make a bow? So that's
Definitely
his theory.
I mean, that's quite a common theme about sort of thinking creatively and thinking differently. So Temple Grandin, for example, is quite a famous autistic woman who, amongst other things, has changed how animal husbandry works. So she's designed places where cattle are kept to lower their anxiety, for example, because the way that she thinks is she puts herself in the shoes of, or the hooves of the animals, and can design buildings which cause less stress, better cattle, which means a higher yield of meat or milk or whatever. And certainly that sort of creative vibe that you were talking about, Barney, is present in people that we know are autistic today. So in autism, you have something quite often called a special interest. So mine, for example, would be genealogy, or at the moment Easter eggs, so, which is an interest that you have that, you know, could be perceived as borderline obsessive, but what it means is that you have a huge drive to learn more or do more in that particular area. So we can certainly apply what we know now to be quite clear indicators to historical figures, but we definitely can't say this person definitely had OCD or this person definitely had autism.
Should we have a look in that case at the Emperor Claudius, maybe? He's the only person I've come across who's sort of, well, whose life has been written about in detail. That's the other problem we come across, is sometimes a lack of proper evidence, of very detailed evidence. But although he's never depicted as disabled or differently abled, it's when you go into written sources about him, it becomes very clear that he seems to have had a limp. He seems to have had some sort of physical differences. He could his neck wobbled and his head would wobble from side to side. He had a stutter. Sometimes his speech was slurred. I think the interesting thing about some of the neural aspects that have been described is that initially he was sort of written off as a child. He was called, dull, or stupid, or, not able to fulfill any kind of political office that maybe his brother or his sister could, or his other relatives, because he's born into the imperial family. So he's expected to take on a prominent political role. But over time, this does seem to improve, and he ends up writing actually a lot of publishable treatises. He writes 20 books on Etruscan history at one point, and he invents 3 new letters for the alphabet.
We've got to hear which letters they were. I know it's a bit of a distraction, but that's juicy stuff.
Yeah, please.
So there are only a couple of examples in which they're actually used, because I think afterwards people were like, no. But one of them is really interesting. It's sort of like it's like a T, but the line across the top of the T has dropped a bit further down, and it's supposed to be a sound that's halfway between a U and an I. It's the sound, as in Maximus. So where you're not saying Maximus and you're not saying Maximus, you're saying Maximus.
So is that kind of like schwa in... Do you know schwa?
That sounds like a schwa to me. We
that
love
like...
schwas in English.
I don't know what a schwa is, but it sounds like a really fancy fine dining restaurant.
I am obsessed with schwa.
What's schwa? I've got a booking at schwa for 7, darling.
It's, so is it a letter in the International Phonetic Alphabet? Is that right? I started talking about this and I'm not actually sure, but it's written as an upside down backwards E, and it's the sound, like if you say sofa.
Oh, they're used in phonetics, aren't they? So if you open a dictionary, it's used in the phonetic bit.
Sorry, that has taken us on a bit of a tangent, but this was a project of Claudius, right?
Yes. This shows that he had a very high functioning brain when he applied it to problems of language or of history.
There are certainly some features there that are quite autism related, or maybe even OCD related. That sort of obsessive writing on subjects that he was quite clearly passionate about. That could be a symptom.
Yeah, quite possibly. I think that's probably very likely. But he's also incredibly neurotic. He gets really, really worried that there are plots against his life all the time. He's not very good at choosing which people around him to trust. I mean, it's a difficult exercise at best if you're someone in power, especially an emperor. So a huge aspect of being emperor was judging cases that are brought before you. And in some instances, he makes really, really smart decisions. In a story with a woman who is disowning her son, and he orders her to marry him. And in that instance, he sort of forces her to say, okay, no, actually, that is my son. I don't want to marry my son. So that's thinking outside the box. But in other cases, he's awful, and he's very easily led by either side. It's this problem with knowing exactly who to trust. He's described as sort of being at one minute, really, really wise, and in other moments, like positively silly. That's the actual word that's used, or how it's translated.
I find it really interesting. Some of the things you've mentioned, Zenia, really do line up with things that we use to diagnose autism now. So, for example, you've described him as finding it difficult to know who to trust, and that's quite a common theme that we see amongst neurodiverse people. So it's quite difficult to pick up on the social cues that would make you believe that someone is lying. So I happen to be quite good at body language and picking up on that. I say that, I'm probably terrible, but being able to understand whether someone is trying to use you for personal gain, especially if you have a position of power, it's quite difficult for some people, especially on the autistic spectrum, to tell if that person has an honest approach to a situation, or if they're looking out to gain something for themselves, or they want to influence you so they benefit themselves or their group of people. So that's quite a common thing. And that sort of logic that you described in terms of court cases, he's very logical. He makes logical decisions. And then some of his cases that he's judged sound like he was described as silly in the direct translation. That fits in with decisions I make at work and at home. I make very logical decisions, but I'll also make decisions that are logical to me and probably me alone, for like my own thought patterns and my own way of thinking. So it does tally up with a possibly autistic person.
One other trait that I think can sometimes happen with autistic people is he's described as reacting like too loudly to things.
Yep.
Yeah. His laugh is just a bit is fairly alarming actually for the people around him. I definitely know some neurodiverse people who laugh too loudly. I wonder if that could be a trait.
It's quite difficult for me sometimes to be around other neurodiverse people who are quite loud, because I can be quite quiet and calm and soft in my personal life. If I'm doing a podcast like now, or if I'm performing, I'm capable of being very extroverted and very loud. But when I come off stage, I like to be calm and quiet.
But it does make me think, he's an emperor and he's still doing emperor stuff and he's still part of his family. So it does make me wonder sort of what people in different socioeconomic brackets, how they would have behaved around someone like Claudius maybe, or someone with a different sort of form of neurodiversity. That's something that we don't have that much insight to in the ancient world, as I mentioned before, because of the sort of issues of things being recorded. It tends to be men, and important men, who get written about, but we just don't know about that many other parts of society.
I think it also depends in terms of that idea of how people react to people behaving differently in the ancient world. It also massively depends on what people thought was the cause of unusual behaviour. But for a lot of ancient Greek history, any kind of abnormal behavior, even any kind of extreme mood, was thought of as being divinely inspired, so of being, caused by the gods, or even caused by kind of possession by the gods. But that really goes both ways in ancient Greece. That can be seen as a gift from the gods and an honor, in which case people behaving strangely, and even people who are seen to have gifts, which we might now really associate with types of neurodiversity, like extremely good memories, that could be seen as an honor or a gift. But then also possession by gods could be seen as a punishment for being evil. So yeah, it's interesting. It sort of goes both ways.
It sounds like an Oprah Winfrey episode where she's like, you get a possession and you get a possession and you get a possession. Like anyone could have a possession.
Yeah. And I think that means that also the idea of hallucinating or seeing or hearing things that weren't there, I think from what I've seen, would have been significantly less stigmatized than it is now because of this idea of divine madness. Plato talks about it quite a lot and says that it's a good thing. He thinks divine madness is good and should be given a lot of respect. I think it's interesting. So you've got Homer, my favorite man, who was blind, supposedly. The mythology says that he's blind. And then also Tiresias, who's also blind. Maybe not so much neurodiversity, but physical differences. They're both blind, but with their blindness comes added gifts. So for Homer, that's the gift of being able to be inspired by the muse and compose and recite the epics. And for Tiresias, he has the gift of prophecy. So the ancient Greeks definitely did have this understanding of sort of being different in one way would then also give you extreme gifts.
It's a misconception that people with autism have sort of like superpowers. There's certainly some abilities that I have because of autism, like hyperfocus, which is the ability to focus in and block everything else out when I'm working, for example. So I can fit in a full working day into 2.5 hours if I'm hyperfocused. So that's an ability that I've got because of autism rather than a deficit. But I really like that the ancient Greeks were like, with this perceived divergence, you have some negative qualities, but a lot of positive qualities as well. So it's almost like you might be blind, but you also have the gift of telling the future, or you may have legs that don't work like other people's legs do, but you are able to, like Bran Stark, Game of Thrones, I guess you can, possess a crow many miles away. It's excellent. So I quite like that, like balance of good with perceived bad. That's something that I experience, I guess, as well. I might have a panic attack in a Tesco, but my God, if you give me a family tree, I'll be able to research it back until, the dawn of time.
I find it interesting, Meg, that you brought up the divine influence, because listeners might remember a couple of weeks ago we were talking about hospitals and healthcare, and I had mentioned that often in ancient Mesopotamia, and especially the texts that originated in Babylonia, they're interested and keen to ascribe illnesses to gods. But in the case of certain behavioral disorders, especially like OCD, they think they found some evidence for a description of OCD. They don't attribute it necessarily to gods and goddesses, but to someone having sworn an oath. Oaths are fairly important in the ancient Near East, and you were bound, by a social contract to fulfill certain roles. And it was such a pervasive idea that if someone was exhibiting obsessive behavior, they would think that they'd sworn a private oath to keep doing that particular thing over and over again, and that was why they were bound to do it. Because they were duty bound, honor bound to do it by this oath that had been sworn.
Oh wow, that's amazing. So that's another explanation, kind of on top of either a biological cause or a divine cause. There's the idea of an oath. That's so cool.
Yeah, it's like explaining it in a social way almost.
Yeah.
I mean, this evidence comes from a Middle Babylonian text called Sherpu, which is an incantation series where basically telling you if you've identified certain problems in your life, or even behaviors that might be considered a disorder from, let's say, the Babylonian norm, you might carry out a particular incantation to get rid of it. And in this case, the subject of the disorder said he does not know why he's compelled to take things. or he doesn't know why he has a phobia of meeting an accursed person. And so there are these descriptions that they did identify certain behaviors, but they couldn't really explain what was causing them. And it certainly wasn't in the same realm as gods and goddesses.
That's really, really interesting. There's also, I think, again, when you mentioned like the link to the physical medicine that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that we get the exact same change in terms of the treatment of neurodiverse conditions or mental health in ancient Greece, that pre-Hippocrates it's very much gods and goddesses, and then Hippocrates comes along and just like he does with physical medicine is like, hang on a minute, what if all of this stuff isn't caused by a supernatural thing, it's caused by a biological cause? And he says, and he's also one of the key figures in saying all of this stuff is in the brain, which again, so that's crucial for even the word neurodiversity. The neuro there refers to the brain. And he says, from nowhere else but the brain comes joys, delights, laughter and games, and sorrows, griefs, despondency and lamentations. I think that might be a bit snappier in the Greek, maybe. But yeah, so that there's that, again, that movement from a divine cause to a biological cause. He says it's all coming from the brain, and that's where we get normal behaviours, but also abnormal behaviours and extremes of emotion. So I think that's really cool. It's where we get that same shift. I
could only find one word that any scholar anywhere has tried to translate as potentially having autistic connotations, which was by these experts called Skurlock and Anderson, who've written a lot about diagnosis in Mesopotamia, and their word is shehanu, which was originally translated as giant, and now appears in the dictionary as ecstatic. They also attempted to describe it as autistic, because the word has associations of unbalance and agitation and mood swings. So it's a description of a behavior that we can describe in neutral terminology now, but for the Babylonians it was a divergence. It was the cause of a curse. A mother might give birth to an unbalanced person, this Shehanu, if she had been, if someone had cursed her in the street.
The whole thing about this person is unbalanced because their mother was cursed on the street is actually not far off how people perceived autistic people and their mothers until very recently. So in the 60s, 70s, 80s, mothers of autistic children were often blamed for giving birth to autistic children because they were called refrigerator mothers. So they were cold and unfeeling towards their children. I think that's probably due to the fact that many of these mothers will have been autistic themselves, because there's a genetic element in autism, and that's really recently. In the grand scheme of things, that has kind of been written off as a misconception and actually quite horrible and blamey. And it's not far different from your child is autistic because you're such a cold, emotionally distant mother, to your child is autistic or unbalanced because you got cursed in the street.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. It's like, it goes to show how much thought has progressed in the last, let's say, 30 years, and also how there may be a grain of biological truth behind this association. But as you say, Flo, it didn't change for thousands of years until quite recently, when scientific and social thought about the autistic spectrum has come on in leaps and bounds.
The way you just both as well been talking about women and how that links to neurodiversity, I think is also definitely something in ancient Greece. And I think earlier, Barney, I don't know if this is linked to anything you've been looking at, but the idea of hysteria, that word comes from the Greek word hystera. So that's another nice etymology for us, which means womb. So the idea of female hysteria, the ancient Greeks thought it was because of the womb moving around the body. And that persisted for a really, really long time. But the ancient Greeks blamed that wandering womb for like so many behaviours, symptoms, physical illnesses in women. So it's definitely possible that neurodiverse women in the ancient world would have been kind of written off as having hysteria.
Definitely. I wonder if there's any record of ancient women. I know that in Victorian times this was moderately common, that women would have bouts of hysteria and then recover. And I wonder if that's related in any way to burnout. So a lot of neurodiverse people will experience something called burnout because they are trying to thrive and live in a world that is geared towards neurotypical people. So I often think that, I might be autistic, but I don't think I'm disabled in any way. I think that the only time I feel disabled is when the world disables me. And that can be as simple as the lights in the supermarket being a bit too bright, or the way that, I don't know, the cinema is extremely loud. Those are sort of sensory overloads that can be quite overwhelming. And the world is geared towards neurotypical people. So I am more likely to have a burnout if I'm doing even just a normal 9-to-5 job. So I can imagine women throughout history doing their sort of whatever it is that they're doing, whether they're raising children and doing housework, or if they're a lucky Spartan woman like we've talked about in the past, running a farmstead, that they will have bouts of burnout where they're just tired and they need to reset, and then they'll be back to normal for a while, and then they'll have another burnout a few months later. I wonder if that's related to being on the spectrum or being a neurodiverse person.
I think it is also fairly exhausting trying to make it in a world that's geared towards men, as anyone who's read Invisible Women will.
Yeah, I would recommend Invisible Women. And another book I'd recommend is Neuro Tribes by Steve Silberman, who is a journalist who had a look at the history of autism. So many people have this misconception that neurodiversity, like autism, ADHD, we're having an epidemic of it. Suddenly, everyone's got a diagnosis, and when I was at school, only one person who was a bit weird was autistic, and now like 8 children in my son's class are autistic, and it wasn't like that in my day. I think actually how it's been throughout history is that slightly eccentric or different people were just that. They were eccentric or different people without understanding why and what neurological mechanism made them different.
We've talked about looking at historical texts and medical texts, but one other thing that I found as an interesting, it's an academic practice, is looking at literature and seeing if any characteristics of fictional characters could be linked by things that were occurring in the real world, because writers throughout history have written about what they know and about what exists around them, even if it is speculative and full of gods and monsters and stuff like that. Humans can't write without a human basis a lot of the time. And I found this really interesting study by a researcher called Amar Anas at the University of Tartu in Estonia, who looked at the Epic of Gilgamesh and tried to find out whether any of the traits that Gilgamesh exhibits could have been inspired by real life people with on the autistic spectrum.
I'm always fascinated by fictional characters who meet those sort of criteria for being a neurodiverse person, because it's thrilling to see someone who reflects part of you back when you read about them or when you learn about them.
Yeah, I mean, some of the examples that came up, because towards the end, you might remember from when we talked about Gilgamesh in relation to love, is that after his partner, Enkidu, dies, Gilgamesh starts wandering in the wild, and he takes very poor care of himself, and he's got this kind of persistent restless spirit, and when he's trying to attain immortality, he's avoiding sleep. And so this Amar Anas was sort of trying to identify these behaviours with the potential acknowledged behaviours that are associated with autism spectrum condition. So yeah, it's difficult to make empirical links, but in terms of representation, as you say, Flo, it's a really novel academic approach, I think.
So the author Caroline Lawrence, she writes fantastic children's books that are set in the ancient world, in ancient Rome. And one of her books is called The Charioteer of Delphi. It's about a boy who clearly exhibits autistic traits. He finds it difficult to speak to people, but he has a very strong affinity for horses, a bit like that. The woman, I can't remember her name, the woman you mentioned earlier, Flo, who does animal husbandry.
That's Temple Grandin, yeah.
Temple Grandin, yeah. So he gets, I suppose, invited to be like a trainee stable boy in Rome. But the other stable boys, that I think they can detect his vulnerability and some of his differences, so they bully him. But his talent is recognised by the stable manager, and he ends up becoming a top charioteer. So I just think that is a fairly creative way of showing maybe some of the difficulties that neurodiverse people had in the ancient world, but also some of the ways that they could push the boundaries of achievement. I mean, given the lack of evidence and the lack of us being able, the inability that we have to say this was definitely the case, I think at the moment, like imagining ourselves in that situation, or the way Caroline Lawrence does, is probably the most helpful exercise we can do.
I agree. It acknowledges the reality, as we discussed right at the beginning, that autism has existed genetically for thousands of years, and deals with that representation in a fictional way that, you know, must reflect a reality that is missing from our historical texts. And yeah, I think that's a very satisfying way of harmonizing all of our interests.
I've really, really enjoyed this podcast, partly because, you know, it's about something that I can finally offer some insight on, which is a nice change. We'll be back to normal, I think, next season with me not knowing anything of what's going on. But before we leave, what did you guys enjoy most about today?
I really enjoyed learning about Meg's example of the travelling womb, and that being an explanation for all sorts of different behaviours.
It's quite an interesting and novel way of diagnosing someone. Yeah, you don't worry about it. Your womb's gone off on a wander.
Yeah, it's gone to Spain. I really liked, Barney, I can't remember what word it was, but the word you were saying that was translated as kind of unbalanced. I thought that was really interesting, the ancient evidence that you had there.
Oh, that's Shehanu.
Yeah, I loved that. That was great.
What I loved about this episode was hearing Zenia's summary of the life of Claudius, and then Flo kind of identifying behaviours that were familiar or maybe even unfamiliar in that, and that kind of dynamic between, you know, the history and the lived experience of autism. I think that was really interesting to hear you guys talking about.
I do have one last fun story, which I think you might enjoy, Flo. It says that when a debate was going on about butchers and vintners, this is in the Senate House, Claudius shouts out, "Now pray, who can live without a snack?" And then he goes on to describe all of the pubs he used to go to.
Oh my God.
Nice.
That's brilliant. It sounds like his special interest is snacks, and I have to say, that's right up my street. That's something that I have a special interest in too. That's brilliant. Well, I think that has to be my favourite thing that I've learned today then. And thank you ever so much for a season of wondrous information. Thanks to Alison, who joined us at the beginning of the season.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to take a little break now for about a month or so, but follow us on Twitter, keep an eye out, and we'll let you know when we're coming back with season 2, which will be full of new adventures into the ancient world and possibly some special guests as well. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Against the Law. If you enjoyed it, hit follow or subscribe so you'll get all our future episodes in your feed. We love hearing from you, so please get in touch with suggestions and feedback on Twitter @AgainstLaw, that's LORE, or email againstthelaw podcast@gmail.com. Bye for now.